What about this moment? What about 2024 feels like an opportune time for a new book on leadership?
It's a book that I've been planning a long time. I was 10 years as British Prime Minister, and then my institute now works in over 40 countries around the world. I've been working with leaders this last 15 years or so. So there's a lot of accumulated knowledge, but also we're at a particular inflection point in global politics. The world's going to be very different. It's going to feel very different. And therefore, trying to encapsulate the lessons of leadership for political leaders seems quite important. There are lots of books written about how to be a better CEO or a better football coach, but no one, as far as I know, who's been in a senior position in government has written a book that's literally just simply about the challenges of governing.
What are things that you know now from your last 10 years you really wish you had known when you were prime minister, especially the first 5 years of your prime ministership?
The whole book is really written to shorten the learning curve. I will say to people, government and politics is probably the one profession of any sort anywhere in the world in which it's possible to rise to a position of enormous importance and power with literally no qualifications. I became prime minister. It was the only job I ever had in government. There was no apprenticeships. There was no working your way up in government. It's a profession in that sense, unlike any other. But where it is like any other is that there are lessons that you can distill. And, you know, I always say this to leaders, prime minister, presidents I work with. You will think your system is unique, but it isn't. Bureaucracies are the same everywhere, really, got the same characteristics. The challenges of governing are the same everywhere. So what I've done is to write the book I wish I'd had when I first came into office. If someone had handed me that as I came in number 10, I think the first term would actually be more productive. By the time I got into the second term, I was already applying some of these lessons because of the experience in the first. But, no one ever wants to admit this about politics, but a lot of it's learning on the job. Now, if you say that to the country, of course, they get terrified because they think, what? If you're learning on the job, what do you mean? But that's the reality. So the book's written from that perspective, and the lessons are really simple and direct, like how you organize your office around you, how you prioritize, how you choose the best people, what's the right approach to policy, how do you handle the criticism from the media today, especially with social media. Basic things. But these are the things that are the difference between success and failure for leaders.
As a follow-up, and I quote, you start at your most popular and least capable and end at your least popular but most capable. Obviously, one solution to that is like you to serve 10 years and then kind of become much more capable along the way. And so having adequate time seems like one answer to it. But as you know, even in your country, the number of prime ministers in the last 7, 8 years is very different from the time when you were there as well. So, what 2 or 3 steps do you suggest as most critical in trying to shorten this capability and popularity gap?
It's perfectly possible, by the way, that some politicians buck that trend. But after a period of time, people get tired with the same leadership and they want change. But when you are doing the job, if you're learning and if you're of a curious bent of mind, then you should become more capable. But I think the most important thing as a leader in any organization is to have clarity of direction. And Britain is a good example of this. When I finished my time as prime minister, we essentially had 3 prime ministers in roughly 3 decades. Margaret Thatcher, John Major, then myself. And there was a certain continuity of policy, particularly around the private sector and so on. And then we were doing things that we felt that the previous Conservative government hadn't got right, but we didn't think everything they'd done was wrong. So there was a certain continuity of policy. And we had a very clear direction. Whether people liked it or not is another matter, but the direction was clear. And one of the things I think that is really important that makes the difference in building your capability is a clear idea of where you're going. I say it's like driving a bus, right? You're the driver of the bus. Now, when you're driving it and you're going to your destination, the passengers will be sitting in the back and they'll be complaining and saying, well, I don't think this is quite right. And that's fine. I wish he was doing this stuff. But they'll sit on the bus and you'll take them along with you. But you stop the bus and start having a conversation about where you're going, you'll never get back on it. And therefore, I think that the first thing starts with that clarity of direction. And then everything else, and as I say, being the person with the plan, everything else you then shape around that. I call it the 4 Ps, right? Which is prioritization. Okay, because try and do everything, you do nothing. Policy, because in the end, getting the right answer is really important. Personnel, it's obvious, but it's all about the people. Get good people around you, you're more likely to succeed. And finally, what is often missing from politics is what I call the 4th P of performance management. In other words, implementation. Or as the French would say, mise en oeuvre. How you put this idea into practice and track it so that you know what you said you would do, you are actually doing.
Let's talk about it. I was thinking it of not as a P, but as a D because you focus so much on delivery and the follow through. Remind the audience of a delivery unit because it's an operating model that most of my audience, which is a business audience, probably is familiar with because in companies that's not uncommon. Say a little bit more about how you pioneered that.
One of the things about political leadership is that when you're trying to win power, you've got to be the great persuader. But when you actually get into power, a lot of it's about being the great chief executive. And this is where it's very similar to running a business. Now, in politics, you're not allowed to say that. Because people say, what do you mean? I mean, it's not a business. You're governing the country. As if that didn't involve executive capacity, capability, and delivery. But of course, in the end, it is about what you achieve. Because in opposition, it's all about the saying. In government, it's about the doing. And doing is much harder. So the important thing is to realize you are going to have to prioritize. And as a leader, of course, everything matters. Everything that's happening in government matters. But there will be some things that are so important to you, in a sense, they define your leadership. So the delivery unit concept, which was very much borrowed from the private sector, was to take the core priorities, not many of them, by the way, 5 or 6, and say, we're going to have a unit at the center of government whose job it is to make sure that these 5 priorities, which should be clear, specific, measurable, and obviously deliverable, are actually delivered. We managed to make a lot of progress on a lot of issues by doing that, because also at the center, often problems in government involve 4 or 5 different departments. So you need to better pull everyone together. And having that tracking mechanism was so important because, again, in any position of leadership, but particularly in government, leaders, I sometimes describe it as a conspiracy of distraction. You've got events and crises and scandals, because always somewhere in government, someone's doing something stupid, it's going to blow up in your face. So to have, when the leader can be temporarily distracted, to have this system that is just continually on those core objectives and priorities, making sure they're delivered, that's it's quite apart from anything else, it gives you ease of mind.
You clearly believe in the ability of business, especially technology and these days Gen AI, to help deliver results, including for governments. What would be the best way that you would say, especially for a new leader or a new governing team, to bridge the private sector expertise with government services delivery, especially at a time when trust in business is also not very high?
This is where what's so important in politics is to get to the right answer. Because often what happens in politics is that people put politics first and policy second. And it should be the other way around. Policy first, what's the right answer, then shape the politics around it. Now, this really matters when you come to this technology revolution. Because my belief is, if I was back in government today, it would be the central mission of my government to understand, master, and harness this technology revolution. mitigate its risks, but above all, access its opportunities, because government's all about process. So you should be able to utilize artificial intelligence, especially as it develops over time and becomes much, much better, and you get more and more data in these large language models that are going to allow you to do things like reforming your planning system, automating your payment system, doing a whole series of things that will get you out of what is the central problem for developed countries today. We're spending more, we're taxing more, and the outcomes are poor. We would never create the National Health Service today in the UK if we were starting from scratch. We wouldn't create the NHS as it is today. Now, all of this technology gives you a chance. It is the big real world thing happening out there. So in my view, the job of the politician is to construct the political narrative that allows you to put that policy, harnessing the technology revolution, at the center of government. It's not to say, well, technology, most people are a bit frightened of it. I'm not sure it really works. Okay, I'm going to leave that to one side. No. If it's the real world event that's happening, if it is the 21st century equivalent of the Industrial Revolution, you need to understand it. And then you need to bring a completely different skill set into government. You need to bring in the people who actually understand it and not expect the bureaucracy to do something it's never going to be capable of doing.
A related question, and I love the chapter about you're never as knowledgeable or as smart as you think. You note the fallacy of equating being powerful and being the decision maker to thinking you're also the smartest person in the room. How would you advise leaders to kind of avoid that pitfall? Because you've won something, you've reached the pinnacle of something, very hard not to think that you're also super smart.
You need to be confident in your own judgment, obviously. But I say this to any leader in any walk of life. The one thing I've learned, not just in politics, but in life, is that if hubris is walking around, nemesis is a very short distance behind. It's a very difficult thing to do this. You've got to balance confidence in and self-belief, because you need that to be a leader, with humility and curiosity. And it's important that, for example, the team you surround yourself with is not frightened of challenging you. Now, once you all come to a decision, everyone gets behind the decision. But you need people who are prepared to say, well, I don't think that's right. That's not going to work. And if you look at any of the great leaders, they were people that had the confidence to want people in the room smarter than them. Not people who press them with their smartness. It'd be a difficult thing to get right, but it's such an important thing to get right. And because it also allows you to adjust. You may start with the plan. I mean, I said it's really important to have a plan, and it is, but rigidity is a bad thing. You've got to have the flexibility to adapt if the circumstances change, or if your understanding of the situation changes. And every mistake I ever made in politics was when I failed to do that.
Just a quick follow-up there, Prime Minister. Is there a bit of a tension between saying that longevity, meaning that if you have like 5, 10 years, you in time become a better leader, and then the question of rigidity, because successful politicians in particular do accumulate a bit of baggage. Is it difficult as you talk to leaders who've been in power for, let's say, 15, 20 years to get them to think of change?
Yeah, sure. The challenge of democracy in this context, by the way, is very clear. And I'm speaking someone, of course, in favor of democracy. The problem with democracy at the moment is that people think short term. They think in electoral cycles. And most change that's really valuable is structural. And structural change takes time. And the advantage of dictatorships, if there is one, provided the leader is clever, is that you get that long-term structural change. The disadvantage, of course, is that when even the benign dictator becomes malign, there's nothing you can do about it, right? By the way, the problem with systems that are undemocratic is that the leaders often are not open to challenge, or people are afraid to challenge them. They're so deferential to them that any nonsense will pass the test as policy. You need the longevity to achieve real change, but you've got to be careful that with it, doesn't come either a thought, well, what worked 10 years ago is going to work now, and sometimes it doesn't, or this belief that I think is very easy to have, which is you stop being curious. Since I've left office, I've learned so much. I mean, it's actually frightening to me how much I've learned. And I think that it is enormously important as a leader to have the capacity constantly to evaluate and reevaluate.
To be fair, Prime Minister, you left office when you were so young relative to all of the current leadership in the world. So I think curiosity would be natural, I suppose.
But it's an important thing because the world is constantly changing, and we're at a moment of enormous change. And I just think, it's important that you're always prepared, not to be uncertain in what you're doing, but not to be so certain the way you've always done it is the way it has to be done.
Just picking back on the point of democracies, since the book has come out, I've gone back and read some of the reviews of it. The part that some people seem to be asking themselves, as long as the government is delivering what its people want, does it really matter whether it's a electoral democracy or not? Just curious about your thoughts. At the end of the day, giving people what they want, is that the best way to think about effectiveness of a government?
No, the best way to think about the effectiveness of the government is to give people what they need to lead more fulfilling and better and more prosperous lives, more healthy lives. You've got to hope that what they need and what they want roughly coincide, or at least they do to a significant degree. But you're right about the argument about democracy, but this is where the challenge, as I say in the book, the challenge of democracy today is efficacy, is getting things done. And the reason why people turn often to populist leaders today is because people think, look, I've had enough, you guys, you conventional politicians, the system's not working for me. So someone comes and promises to blow the system up and do things completely differently. Why not? I'll give it a go. And I think that whereas when I would go to countries, when I was prime minister, and they would, let's say, not be a democratic country, but the leader would always be having a conversation that assumed that ultimately the height of achievement constitutionally for a country was a democracy. That was kind of an accepted thought. But today I would say it's challenged. I think a lot of people say, well, I'm looking at your democracies and the way it functions, and you guys seem to be in a constant state of disarray. So does this really work? And I think today you're going to have to prove the case for democracy rather than simply assume it. And that's been a big change.
Can we talk a little bit more about trust in leadership? And you write, and I quote, the time to trust a politician most is when they're telling you what you least want to be told. But at the same time, in politics, and you know this well, doesn't straight talk also have downsides for a leader?
Yeah, it certainly does, yeah. But it's an important thing to say this to people because it is one of the paradoxes of politics that if a politician's doing something that's unpopular, knowing it's unpopular, unless they're an idiot, they're doing it because they actually believe in it. So that's why I say to people, the time to trust a politician most is when they're doing something you least like, because at least you should ask, why are they doing it then? Maybe it's because they genuinely believe it to be right. And any leader that's ever done a big reform or restructuring of the company, whilst, I say in the book that there's a rhythm to it. When you first propose it, everyone tells you it's a bad idea. And when you're doing it, it's hell. And after you've done it, you wish you'd done more of it. Yes, of course, trust in politics is very important, but I think you've got to be very clear what you mean by that. Because superficially, if you look at polling, I often find people trust politicians most when they're telling them what they want to hear. So if you're giving out a lot of money to them, yeah, they really trust you. You're telling them that the public finances are terrible, we're going to have to make some cuts. They totally distrust you, but in the end, Doing the difficult thing may be the right thing. If you want trust, you've got to go deeper than that. And I think you get to something that's more akin to respect than trust in that way that people look at barometers of trust. It's a bit like with business as well. I mean, people often distrust business because they think, well, these guys are interested in making a profit. They're not really trying to do good. They just want to make a profit. But on the other hand, the lesson of history is that a competitive private sector, which is a pursuit of the profit motive, actually probably ends up with the most efficient service. You often find people don't trust business, but the actual business they're working for, they do trust them because they know the leadership. I just think that this concept of trust, got to be very careful because there are definitions of it that I think can be quite misleading when you're trying to understand what people really feel.
The book has so many wonderful practical ideas, from negotiating to meetings to how to respond to social media and how to not be too paranoid. The part I would have loved to see more of is, as a leader, how do you build that resilience muscle? Obviously, you're curious, you talk to a lot of people, but are there things that you do from a self-care, if you will, that kind of help you deal with the fact that there's just so much happening in the world?
What happens to anyone who gets into the media eye in a big way is that at a certain level they become dehumanized. They're treated as an object and not as a person. And, you are a person. And so you feel when things are said about you that are hurtful or disrespectful or horrible. And, social media today is a tsunami of the insult and abuse. So as a leader, you got to protect yourself against that, mentally in your own head, as a government or as a business. And you do have to care about yourself. That's why I say in the book, it's important to have a bit of your life that's not just about politics. Why it's important that you have time for friendship and family. Resilience is, if it's not there naturally, you develop it, because otherwise it's very tough. And I found in the end, the best way of doing it was to realize how immensely blessed you were and are to be in a position of leadership. Yeah, and it's voluntary. You get severe criticism, but you chose it. And I think it's very important that you, what I used to call a bit of a zen, get that little bit of, spiritual evenness, because otherwise, you've got no protection in your own mind.
It's very clear from the beginning and throughout the book, and that there's a joyfulness about what you're suggesting to people, and looking back and looking ahead. But it comes at a time when there's a lot of pessimism in the world and declining trust in all institutions. And also, more importantly, especially in the US or other major Western countries, when asked, do you think the future is going to be better for your children than it was in the past? There's a lot more like fear that that's not going to be the case. So, why are you such a profound optimist in circa 2024?
I think I'm naturally optimistic. But I think the other thing is also to look at this, it's not through purely Western eyes. If you look at India today and you ask people in India, are you more optimistic now than you were 25 years ago? I think they say yes. China's lifted more people out of poverty than ever before anywhere in human history. I'm constantly going to countries in Asia, in Latin America, where, they've got a lot of problems, but they feel they've got a future. Actually, many African countries, you've got higher levels of optimism than you do in Western Europe. So I think this is in part a kind of Western problem. We do need to recover also a sense of the possible, and we need to think of ourselves think more optimistically. And the leaders have got to be optimistic. I think I say in the book, no one wants to get on a plane with a depressed pilot. Okay, you want your leaders to be showing some sense of, we can do this thing. It's going to be all right. And I actually also think technology does genuinely offer us the chance to solve things we've never been able to solve before. So, you've got changing geopolitics, changing world, lots of problems. Humanity's always had problems, but we've not ever yet come across a problem that we haven't been able to solve. And I think we can solve these problems too. And in any event, the one thing I'm absolutely sure of, that this is a life lesson. If you think of yourself as a victim, you never get anywhere. So you need your own agency, and we got to recover that agency in the West right now and think of ourselves as able to do things and with our best days ahead of us and not behind us.
What's been the response to the book, and how you felt about it?
Well, I wrote it in very short chapters, as you know, and I deliberately made it easy to read. I said to the publishers, and I think when it was first published in the UK, we came in second in the Sunday Times bestseller list behind Gillian Anderson's Female Erotica. And I thought, well, actually, even I would prefer to read a book on female erotica than I would on governing. But I tried to write it in a way that is simple. And so the reaction has been interesting, because a lot of people have said, well, this has got more than just politics in it. It's about leadership more generally. But people in politics, obviously people are able to say mainly nice things to you, but because it's written by someone who's done the job, it chimes so much with the people doing it now. They say, no, this is exactly what it's like. It's written to be something people can go back to over time.
Great. Well, Prime Minister, thank you so much. I really appreciate you making the time for us.
Ajit, thank you very much indeed. All the very best to you and everyone at McKinsey too.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.